Prison warden, 18 years commanding with an iron fist, until one inmate did something no one would ever dare to do. What happened next changed everything. A miracle of the Virgin Mary that began in the most unlikely place and broke a man who once seemed impossible to reach. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. Richard Lawson was 54 years old and had spent 18 years as the director of the women's penitentiary. You know that boss everyone respects, but no one likes? The one who makes everything run smoothly but makes the air turn cold the moment he walks into a room? Richard was exactly that. The prison ran like clockwork under his command. 0 serious incidents in the last 5 years. Inmates followed their routines. Guards obeyed orders without question. Everything in place, everything controlled. But there was a cost. The guards learned not to ask personal questions, not to seek closeness. Richard would shut down any attempt at conversation that wasn't strictly about work. The inmates called him Iceman behind his back. Richard knew, and secretly liked it. The ice protected. The ice kept order. Every day Richard made his rounds through the prison. He checked every section, observed, took notes, corrected any deviation immediately. The route always passed by the chapel, a small room on the 2nd floor, simple wooden benches, a statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar, faded blue mantle, hands extended. Richard never went in. He only looked through the window on the door. There was always someone inside, praying, crying, seeking something Richard was certain didn't exist. He saw it as wasted time, but it was allowed by law, so he tolerated it. Just that. Tolerated. At home, things were different. At least, they tried to be. Catherine, his wife of 26 years, still smiled when he arrived, still asked about his day, still tried to talk during dinner. Richard answered. Of course he did, but always briefly. All was surface level. How was work? Normal. Did anything interesting happen? Nothing much. Catherine had stopped digging deeper years ago, but the love was still there, quiet, persistent, waiting. Richard didn't notice, or pretended not to notice. It was easier that way. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old and had been incarcerated for 2 years. In the first months, Sarah was broken inside. She lost weight, barely spoke. The other inmates learned to leave her alone. But then something changed. Sarah began going to the chapel every day, always at 3 p.m. without failing. She would kneel before the statue of the Virgin Mary and pray for exactly 30 minutes. Her hands held a blue rosary, glass beads that caught the light from the windows. The rosary had belonged to her grandmother, the only personal item she managed to keep when she was imprisoned, the only piece of the outside world she still had. The other prisoners began to notice. There was something different about Sarah after she prayed, a peace, a calm. "How can you stay so calm in this chaos?" asked Lisa, an inmate who shared a cell with her. Sarah gave a gentle smile. "I pray." Lisa didn't understand, but she respected it. Over time, other inmates began asking Sarah to pray for them, for families, for children, for forgiveness, for things that seemed impossible inside those walls, and Sarah prayed for all of them. It was a Tuesday in October. Richard was doing his usual rounds. He passed by the chapel at 3:10 p.m., as always. He looked through the window in the door. Sarah was there, on her knees, rosary in hand, eyes closed, calm breathing. Something in that scene irritated Richard more than usual. Maybe it was the peace on her face. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't felt peace in years. He opened the door. The sound echoed through the chapel. Sarah opened her eyes but did not stand. She only turned slightly. "Every day the same thing," Richard said, his voice sharp. 30 minutes wasted on superstition. Sarah looked at him. No anger, no fear, just that unsettling calm. "I pray for everyone here, Mr. Lawson," she said softly, "including you." Richard let out a dry laugh. "Save your prayers for someone who needs them, Mitchell." He walked out, closed the door harder than necessary. But as he walked down the hallway, her words echoed, "including you." Why did that bother him so much? 5 days later, the phone rang at 11 a.m. Richard was in his office reviewing reports when his secretary knocked on the door. "Mr. Lawson, it's urgent, Regional Hospital." Something in her voice made Richard's stomach tighten. He answered, "Mr. Lawson, this is Dr. Martinez. Your wife, Catherine, was admitted to the emergency room this morning. You need to come immediately." The world narrowed. "What happened?" "I'd prefer to explain in person, but it's serious." Richard was in his car within 2 minutes. At the hospital, Dr. Martinez led him to a private room. The doctor's expression was careful, professional. But there was something there. Pity, perhaps. "Mr. Lawson, the tests show a severe condition. We need to begin treatment immediately, but I have to be honest with you." The words that came after were a blur. Medical terms, percentages, stages. The only clear thing was this: Catherine was very sick, and the odds weren't good. Richard walked into the room where Catherine was. She tried to smile when she saw him. "Sorry to worry you," she said, her voice weak. Richard held her hand. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. In the weeks that followed, Richard operated on autopilot, worked during the day, hospital at night. Catherine began the treatments. She lost weight. She lost that smile that had always greeted him. But she never complained. Richard, on the other hand, was collapsing inside. But no one would ever see it. The ice had to remain. At work, he became even more rigid. He snapped at a guard over a late report, cut the budget for small comforts the inmates had. "What's going on with him?" the guards whispered. But no one asked him directly. One day, during his rounds, Richard walked past the chapel. Sarah was there, as always. He stopped, looked through the window. She prayed with her eyes closed, the blue rosary shining between her fingers. And for a brief moment, so brief Richard almost didn't notice, he felt something strange. Envy, maybe. She had peace. He had nothing. It was a Friday, 3 weeks after Catherine's diagnosis. Richard was in his office when Officer Martins walked in. "Mr. Lawson, Inmate Mitchell asked to speak with you." Richard didn't even lift his eyes. About what? She didn't say, but she insisted it was important. Richard exhaled, irritated. "Bring her." 5 minutes later, Sarah walked in. She was calm, as always. But today there was something different, determination. "What do you want, Mitchell?" Richard asked, his voice rough. Sarah remained silent for a moment. Then she said softly, "Mr. Lawson, I don't know what's happening in your life, but I know you're hurting." Richard felt as if he had taken a punch. "That's none of your business." "I know," Sarah agreed, "but even so..." She took something out of her pocket. "The blue rosary. This rosary belonged to my grandmother. It's the only thing I have. She taught me that when we don't know what to do anymore, the Virgin Mary does." She placed the rosary on his desk. "Leave," Richard said, his voice hard. Sarah looked at him for a moment, then left without saying another word. Richard stayed alone in the office. The blue rosary was on the desk, the beads catching the light from the window. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. The beads were smooth, polished by years of use. He put it in his pocket. That night, Richard went straight from work to the hospital. Catherine was worse. The treatments were not working as expected. Dr. Martinez had been honest earlier that day. "We need to prepare for every possibility." Richard sat beside Catherine's bed. She was asleep, her breathing uneven. Machines beeped softly around them. He looked at her. 26 years she had stood by his side, waiting, trying, loving a man who had forgotten how to love her back, and now she was slipping away. And he had done nothing to deserve that love. Nothing. Richard felt something rising in his throat, something he had held back for years. Decades, maybe. His hands began to tremble. "No!" The word escaped before he could stop it. "No, no, no!" Then the tears came. Not the controlled tears of a strong man, real tears, the kind that hurt, the kind you hold in for so long that when they finally come out, they drag everything with them. He didn't know what to do. For the first time in years, when he always had answers, always had control, he was completely lost. His hand automatically went to his pocket. He felt the rosary. He took it out, looked at the blue beads in the dim hospital room light. His hands were shaking so much he almost dropped it. "I don't deserve help," he said into the silence. "I know I don't deserve it, but she does. Catherine deserves it." He squeezed the rosary tight, the glass beads pressing into his palm. "Please." His voice was unrecognizable, raw, desperate. "Please, I'll do anything, anything. Just don't take her. Please." He stayed there, crying, holding that blue rosary as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. And at some point, too exhausted to go on, he fell asleep in the chair, his face wet with tears, the rosary still clenched in his hands. And he dreamed. They weren't the usual confused dreams. This one was different, vivid, too real to be just imagination. He was in the prison chapel, but transformed. Soft light, golden and warm, filled every corner, and someone was there, a woman, blue mantle. It wasn't the statue. It was real, breathing, present. She looked at Richard, and in that gaze was everything he couldn't name: compassion, understanding, love without conditions. She didn't say anything. She simply turned toward where Catherine was lying, there in the dream, in that impossible chapel. The woman in blue placed her hands over Catherine, and she smiled. Richard woke up. It was 3:17 a.m. The hospital room was quiet. The machines still beeped softly, but something was different, a smell, soft, sweet. Roses. Richard looked around. There were no flowers in the room, no perfume, nothing that could explain that fragrance, but it was there, unmistakable. He looked at Catherine. She was still asleep, but her breathing seemed calmer, more regular. Richard gripped the rosary tighter. "Please," he whispered, "just that. Please." In the days that followed, something began to change. On Wednesday, Dr. Martinez walked into the room with an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. "Today's tests showed something unexpected," he said, looking down at the clipboard. "There's improvement, small but real." Richard felt his heart speed up. "Improvement? I don't want to create false hope. It's still early, but the numbers are better than yesterday." Dr. Martinez was cautiously optimistic. On Friday, more improvement. The illness was regressing, slowly, gradually. "Spontaneous remission," Dr. Martinez said, shaking his head. "It's not common, but it happens." Her body decided to fight back. Richard said nothing. But every night, alone in the hospital room, he held the blue rosary. 6 weeks later, Catherine was discharged. The doctors called it a remarkable recovery, rare cases where everything simply works. It was a Monday morning, 2 months after Catherine returned home. She was recovered, still weak, but getting better every day. Richard had returned to work. For the first time in months, he felt different. The ice had cracked. Not completely, but enough. During his rounds, he passed by the chapel. Sarah was there, as always, but this time Richard walked in. Sarah finished her prayer and stood up. When she turned around, she saw Richard standing there. He was holding the blue rosary. "Mitchell," he said, his voice different from what she remembered, softer, more human. Richard extended the rosary to her. "Thank you." Sarah looked at the rosary, then at him. And she smiled, that peaceful smile that always annoyed him. But now he understood. She took the rosary. "The Virgin Mary never abandons those who ask for help," Sarah said softly, "even when we don't believe yet, even when we think we don't deserve it." Richard stayed silent for a long moment. He left the chapel. But something had changed permanently. The months that followed were different. Richard was still the warden, still maintained order, but he was different now. The guards noticed. He asked about their families. He smiled occasionally. He listened. The inmates noticed, too. He approved improvements to the library, expanded chapel hours, even stopped once to really talk to a prisoner who was crying in the hallway. "What happened to the Iceman?" they whispered. Thompson, the guard, finally found the courage to ask, "Mr. Lawson, you've been different lately, in a good way." Richard considered the question. Then he simply said, "I learned that control isn't the same thing as strength, and that sometimes we need to let go to find what really matters." In May, Sarah completed her sentence. She would be released. On the day of her departure, Richard was at the gate. Wardens didn't do that, but he was there. Sarah walked out carrying a small bag with her few belongings. When she saw Richard, she stopped. "Mr. Lawson, Mitchell." They looked at each other for a moment. "Good luck out there," Richard said. Sarah nodded. She began walking toward the gate. Then she stopped. Looked back. "Mr. Lawson?" "Yes?" "Keep praying, even when you don't know the words. She always listens." 3 months later, it was a Sunday morning. Richard and Catherine were at Mass, sitting side by side on a wooden pew. For the first time in years, it had been Catherine's idea. "I want to give thanks," she had said. "I don't know exactly to whom, but I want to give thanks." Richard didn't argue. He simply said, "Me too." The church was simple. Wooden pews, colored stained glass, and on the altar a statue of the Virgin Mary, blue mantle, hands extended. During the Mass, while the priest spoke, Richard looked at the statue, and he thought of Sarah, a woman who prayed every day, who asked for others before asking for herself, who gave her only material possession to a man who despised her, because her faith was bigger than his pride. Richard felt tears in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. Catherine noticed, held his hand. "Are you okay?" Richard nodded. "I am. For the first time in many years, I truly am." After Mass, they walked to the car. The morning sun was warm, the sky cloudless. "Richard," Catherine said softly, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For finally letting me in, for letting the walls fall." Richard stopped, looked at his wife. "I only regret that I had to almost lose you to learn." Catherine smiled. "What matters is that you learned. Because in the end, that's what faith does. It finds the cracks in the strongest walls and lets the light in." Before we finish, I want to invite you to become part of our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and share received blessings. If you feel in your heart the desire to join this prayer chain, click below and become a member of the channel today, and come pray with us. And look, if you made it this far, to the very end of Richard and Sarah's story, do one thing for me. Write in the comments, "Blue Rosary," the object that a female inmate gave to the man who humiliated her, and that changed everything. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached. And every time I read "Blue Rosary" in the comments, I will know that one more person believes that miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Write in the comments about a miracle you have witnessed or experienced, and share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing and protecting you and your family. Amen.